It was a regular evening in Brooklyn. Mike Tyson was heading home after recording his podcast, relaxed, in a tracksuit, water bottle in hand. He wasn't the same Iron Mike who once stepped into the ring to destroy. But he was still a legend. He was respected, known, loved, but not by everyone. "Hey, you! Hands up!" Now, Mike turned around. A young white cop, aggressive, trigger-happy, stood with his gun pointed directly at him. His eyes flared with something that resembled duty, but was really fear laced with prejudice. "What's going on?" Mike asked calmly. "Don't ask questions, boy. You match the description of a car thief in the area." "Me? I'm Mike Tyson, man. Don't care who you are." Down on the ground, a crowd began to gather. People recognized Mike. Phones came out. Cameras started rolling. "That's Tyson." "Are you serious right now?" The officer, feeling the situation slipping away, lunged at Mike, trying to twist his arms. Mike stepped back, but the cop shoved him hard. Tyson, a man who'd spent a lifetime defending and attacking, reacted instinctively. One punch. Lightning fast. Right to the jaw. The cop dropped. The crowd gasped. And all hell broke loose. The night was anything but quiet. The punch Mike Tyson landed on the cop had gone viral in under an hour. Hundreds of videos, from every angle, and every resolution, flooded social media. The comments were a fiery blend of awe, outrage, support, and hate. He was defending himself. He had no right to hit a cop. That's Mike freaking Tyson. What did you expect? Just another black man thinking he's above the law. While the internet burned, a storm was brewing inside the precinct. The officer who took the punch had woken up in the hospital with a concussion and missing teeth. His pride hurt worse than his jaw. "We can't let this slide," growled the precinct captain, an older man with steel-gray hair and a permanent scowl. "He may be a boxing legend, but he assaulted an officer. That's an attack on all of us." "Sir," a young lieutenant dared to speak up, "the video clearly shows the officer provoked him." "I don't give a damn about the video. He needs to be charged. Issue the warrant. Now." Meanwhile, outside Mike's house, a crowd had gathered. Fans. Reporters. Onlookers. Cameras rolling nonstop. "Mike, do you regret it? Mike, are you going to turn yourself in? Mike, did you hit him too hard?" Tyson stood by the window, watching the chaos unfold with weary eyes. He wasn't afraid. He'd walked through fire and carried it with him. But he knew the system was ready to turn him into a scapegoat. Just another black man they could break, fame be damned. His phone rang. His lawyer. "Mike, the warrant's been signed. They'll be there within the hour." "Let them come," Tyson said. "If they want war, I'll give them war. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. The story is just getting started, and what's coming is even more intense, dramatic, and powerful. Every chapter hits harder. Every line tells the truth. Support the channel, and let's keep going." Less than an hour had passed since his lawyer's call. Mike Tyson's house stood in eerie silence, time seeming to slow. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply sat in a chair in the middle of the living room. In his hands, an old framed photo, young Mike with Cuz D'Amato. His gaze was calm. Determined. He knew they weren't coming just to arrest him. They were coming to crush him. Suddenly, floodlights. Blinding white beams lit up the windows. Then, a loudspeaker. "Michael Tyson. This is the Los Angeles Police Department. Come out with your hands up. You have 60 seconds. Hundreds of officers surrounded the mansion. Riot shields. Tactical trucks. K-9 units. Snipers. It looked like they were preparing to raid a drug lord. News cameras were already streaming live. Bold headlines scrolled across the screen. "Breaking, Tyson house raid. Boxer versus system. Black man targeted again." Mike stood up, placed the photo on the table. He put on a black tank top, old boxing shorts, and gloves. He wasn't going to fight, but he wanted to look like the man who never bowed. "Let them see who they're trying to break," he whispered. 60 seconds passed. An explosion. The front door blasted open as SWAT stormed in. Barking dogs. Screams. Flashbangs. Smoke. Chaos. Get on the ground. Face down. Do not resist. Show us your hands. But Tyson didn't move. He stood still, a statue. His eyes cold as steel. One officer rushed in to restrain him. Tyson turned his head, met the man's eyes, and said calmly, "You're not afraid because I hit you. You're afraid because I'm black and I didn't bow." The officer struck him with a baton. Tyson staggered but didn't fall. They tackled him, forced him down, cuffed him. He didn't resist. Outside, the cameras kept rolling. Millions watched the legend dragged out in handcuffs, drenched in sweat and smoke. Shirtless. Humiliated. Reporters shouted, "Mike! Will you fight this in court? Mike, any words for your fans? Mike, do you regret it?" He turned to the cameras and rasped, "I only regret that we still call this freedom." The court hearing was scheduled the very next day. No delays. The name was too big. The situation too tempting. The morning began with live streams, reporters, bloggers, legal analysts, and angry mobs of opinion. Some demanded to punish the thug, others cried free the legend. But everyone wanted one thing, a show. And that's what they got. Mike arrived in court in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something primal, the fire of a man who refused to be broken. The courtroom was full. Some stood in silence. Others wept. Some held signs, "Justice for Tyson, stop racist policing, the system is broken." The judge, a white man in his 60s, gray-bearded, cold diction, opened the proceedings formally. The state versus Michael J. Tyson. Charges: assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, verbal threats. Prosecution: are you ready? "Ready, Your Honor," answered the assistant DA. Young, confident, with rehearsed arrogance. "We intend to prove that the defendant, regardless of his status, knowingly assaulted a law enforcement officer. Multiple videos online confirm the attack. We request he remain in custody until trial, and we will pursue the maximum sentence." Mike's lawyer, a seasoned Jewish attorney with a soft voice and sharp mind, rose. "Your Honor, I request we review footage from nearby security cameras and examine the officer's conduct. My client is not a criminal, he's a man who was attacked. He did not strike first, he defended himself. And in this country, that's not a crime. Or is it now?" Murmurs in the courtroom. The judge bangs his gavel. Then, something unexpected. New footage is presented. A security camera from a store near the scene. Footage mysteriously left out of discovery. It shows the officer walking down the street, spotting Mike, grabbing his radio and saying, "Got a big black guy here. Looks like somebody. I'll check him out. Might have something. I'll cuff him if needed." Silence. The prosecutor turns pale. The judge adjusts his glasses. "Where did this come from?" he asks. "Activists, Your Honor. People are digging. The truth is surfacing." The judge leans back in his chair. He knows this isn't a clean case, and if he sticks to the old script, the media will eat him alive. This court is adjourned until tomorrow. The defendant, he looks at Mike, is placed under house arrest, not jail. No travel outside city limits. The courtroom erupts in applause. The prosecutor fumes. Mike lifts his head. And for the first time in days, he smiles. The night before the next hearing was restless. Mike lay on the hard cot, listening to the scraping of keys and the distant shouting of inmates. But this time, it wasn't the noise that kept him awake, it was the sense of change. Something was shifting. Early the next morning, his lawyer Marcus Bell burst into the holding room. His expression was hard, but for the first time, there was light in his eyes. "We got it, Mike," he said, slamming his laptop open. Bodycam footage from another officer. They tried to bury it. Someone inside leaked it to the press. Mike leaned forward. On the screen, it was all clear. Officer Peter Mallory ran toward him with his weapon drawn, never identifying himself. "No, you're under arrest. No police. Just a scream on the ground. You bastard," and a baton swing. "They won't bury this," Bell said grimly, "but they'll fight like hell." Meanwhile, in the police department, tension was rising. Lieutenant Garcia, a Latino officer with 2 decades of service, stood up in a meeting. We're covering for a man who crossed the line. If we back Mallory, we become criminals too. Some colleagues turned their faces. Some muttered traitor, but Garcia stood firm. Leaks followed. The media unearthed complaints filed against Mallory, excessive force, buried internal reprimands. The narrative grew darker, and public rage escalated. Protests swelled in the streets. People marched with Mike's face on posters. Not the fighter, but the man who stood up to injustice. He didn't throw the first punch. He defended himself, shouted an activist into a megaphone. What would you do if someone attacked you from behind? The courthouse was packed that day. Reporters, civil rights leaders, even retired fighters came to show support. The prosecutor looked tense. He knew things were slipping. We have new evidence, Bell said calmly, and we're demanding a full review. The judge cleared the courtroom. Back in the cell, Mike sat again in silence. Same walls, same bench, but he no longer felt alone. Behind him were people, voices, truth. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a crack in the armor of the system. When the truth comes out, the system retaliates, but not with open confrontation. It strikes from the shadows, through disinformation, setups, lies. The morning after the footage leaked, one of the biggest news channels aired a special report, Mike Tyson, aggressor behind the hero mask. A woman, a former police worker, claimed that Mike had assaulted officers in the past. Tears, shaky voice, emotional appeal, no evidence, no records, just pure performance. But the public loves drama, especially when it tears down a legend. That same day, a new lawsuit was filed against Mike, allegedly. He had assaulted a parking security guard 10 years ago. The case had been dropped back then. No charges, no camera evidence, but now it was resurrected. It's coordinated, Bell muttered, scanning through his laptop. They can't win in court, so they'll destroy you in the public eye. Let them try, Mike said quietly. I've been through hell. I won't break. At the next press conference, the prosecutor shifted tactics. Her message was now clear. The defendant is an aggressive man with a violent history. He poses a threat to public safety. They don't care about truth, Bell said. It's politics now. They want to win at any cost. And then the next strike, Mike was moved to solitary confinement. No warning, no explanation. Why? He yelled as guards led him away. Where's my lawyer? Where's the judge? Orders from above, one muttered. 4 cement walls, a hard cot, no calls, no books, no letters, absolute silence. 1 day, 2, 3, time blurred. They were trying to break him from within. Outside, Bell fought alone. The media was bought. Prosecutors were politically fueled. Even some activists started backing away, afraid of the mess. But Bell wouldn't stop. I know who's behind this, a former investigator whispered, handing him a flash drive. Follow the money. Mallory's got powerful allies. On the flash drive, emails between the prosecutor and Mallory's former partners. Unmistakable. We need Tyson isolated until the verdict. He's too dangerous. If he walks, we lose union support. Make it look legal. Bell hadn't slept in days. He was under siege, but he knew if he stopped now, they'd eat Mike alive. On day 7 in solitary, Mike began to hear voices from his past. His coach, his mother, opponents, reporters, fans, some accusing, others encouraging. The silence became a chorus of pain. You can't lose. You're not allowed. The voice whispered. You're not Mike Tyson if you quit. He stood up, leaned his forehead against the cold wall, and whispered. I'll outlast you all. I'll come back, even if the world is against me. That very night, like a sign, he was escorted out of solitary. Someone on the inside had broken ranks and defied orders. Mike took his first step, back toward the light. Mike returned to the general block exhausted, but unbroken. There was something new in his eyes, not just anger, not even rage, but pure determination. They tried to erase me, he told Bell during their first meeting since solitary. Now I'll do what scares them the most. I'll speak. You sure? I'll say everything, loud and clear. Within 24 hours, Mike had a camera in front of him. His old friend, a documentary filmmaker, pulled legal strings to get 30 minutes with him to record a public statement. Mike sat, took a deep breath, and spoke. My name is Michael Gerard Tyson. I'm no saint. I've made mistakes. I've been to the bottom, but I survived. I rose. I tried to make things right. I fought not just in the ring, I fought for my name. He spoke about being stopped because he was black, about how the system always found a way to put you down if you didn't fit the mold, about how even legends are crushed if they make people uncomfortable. They call me a threat? A threat to who? The ones protecting dirty cops? The ones afraid of the truth? He spoke for 28 minutes. No edits, no script, just his voice. 2 hours later, the video was online. 10 hours later, 20 million views. A day later, half the country was sharing it. And 36 hours after, a crowd stood outside the courthouse. Hundreds, then thousands. Signs everywhere. Justice for Tyson. Fists of truth. Free the champ. The next day, Bell got a threat. Anonymous note, shut up or disappear. He smirked. That means we hit a nerve. They weren't the only ones shaken. Prosecutor Mallory, watching things spiral out of control, called an emergency meeting. We're losing ground. This isn't just a trial anymore. This is a political explosion. Meanwhile, in prison, Mike had become a symbol. Even guards started nodding to him. One whispered, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Across cities, protests erupted. Outside police departments, courthouses, hundreds of people repeating the same line from his video. I am Mike Tyson. I am not a criminal. I am the voice of the unheard. But right when the movement reached its peak, the system struck again. In a security incident, a guard staged a provocation, instigating a fight between inmates. Mike was thrown into solitary again, this time under the pretense of being a security risk. It was desperation. It was fear. They knew, if he got out, he wouldn't just be a man. He'd be a movement. But it was too late. Too many had woken up. Too many had seen the truth. That night, outside the prison, like thunder splitting the sky, a voice roared. A crowd gathered at the gates. Someone took a megaphone. Free Mike Tyson. Release the legend. If you ignore the voice of truth, you'll hear the voice of the streets. And for the first time since the trial began, the city mayor addressed reporters. We are closely monitoring the situation. There will be an internal review of the prosecutor's actions. And at that moment, even from inside a cell, Mike realized he had already changed the game. The crowd outside the courthouse was growing larger each day. People were waiting for the moment when Mike would walk out, when the system, under the pressure of truth and public outrage, would have no choice but to free him. And finally, the day had come. The court hearings were set. The trial was becoming Mike's fate, but also a turning point for the justice system itself. It was the moment when the country could either trust its justice or understand that it had long ago failed. And this was when the true storm began. Mike sat in his solitary confinement cell, his eyes showing no fear, only certainty. He knew what he had to do. He knew that his strength now was not in his fists but in his words. He had become the voice for hundreds of thousands who had sat in silence, afraid to speak up, afraid for their lives. We're with you, Mike, Bell said, visiting him. But you need to be prepared. Next week, there'll be cameras everywhere. Your statement isn't just about defending yourself. It's your final fight. Mike nodded, his gaze hardening. I'm ready. This isn't just about me. It's for all of us. For the ones who are silent. For the ones who are scared. On the day of the trial, when Mike was led toward the courtroom, thousands of people gathered outside. These weren't just boxing fans. These were the people. This was the moment when the system faced real power. The crowd chanted, "Free Tyson. Black Lives Matter. Freedom for those who fight the system." When Mike entered the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. He walked in with his head held high, but the feeling that the entire world was watching him never left. His path, his fight, his will, it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had never received justice, about the ones who were suppressed, about the ones who could never speak out. Across the aisle, the police officers who had long been part of this tyranny sat with cold eyes. Mike felt their hostility. His presence was already an inconvenience for them. They had no idea how to handle him. "You accuse me of violence?" Mike began, his voice loud and clear. "But I wasn't violent. I was defending myself. Why is it that in America, people like me are always seen as threats? Why are people with my skin color always treated as enemies?" The judge, clearly taken off guard, rose to object. But Mike continued, "I'm standing here not because I'm a champion, but because they want to destroy me. Me, a simple man who isn't afraid to speak the truth. But maybe it's already too late to hide the truth." Outside the courtroom, the crowd erupted. Shouts, signs, music filled the air. It wasn't just a court hearing anymore, it was a revolution. The courtroom was now a true storm. Prosecutor Mallory, who thought she could win this trial with ease, now found herself in a panic. Mike's unexpected support and the public outrage forced her to reconsider her strategy. Nothing was simple anymore. "How can you argue Mike Tyson used excessive force?" one of the defense attorneys asked. "Look at the system. It's the system that forced him to defend himself. It's the system that made him a victim." And this was the moment when even the toughest of police officers began to have doubts. One former officer, who had initially been sure of the prosecution's case, could no longer stay silent. "I was part of this," he said. "I was on that side. But I can't anymore. He's right. We were wrong." The crowd exploded again. This trial was no longer just a trial. It had become a turning point for the entire nation. The question was no longer just about what to do with Mike, but what to do with everyone who had suffered from oppression, tyranny, and injustice. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, the prosecutor tried to suppress the wave of support for Mike. She knew that she had to win this case, or everything would lose its meaning. Mike, however, remained composed, his eyes burning with fire. He knew that the victory was no longer in his hands. He knew the real fight wasn't about winning in court. It was about winning the battle for society. "We will fight," he said, "and it doesn't matter what happens to us. The point is not the court. The point is to make them know that we saw everything, and we're not silent anymore." The crowd outside the courthouse had not quieted down, but Mike kept moving forward. Every morning, he woke up knowing his life had taken on a new meaning. He was no longer just a man, no longer just a boxer. He had become a symbol of resistance, of the fight against a system that had crushed those who could not defend themselves. But inside, Mike felt that his journey was only just beginning. He was no longer just a person. He was a face of change, a symbol of the battle against the system that oppressed and crushed those who couldn't protect themselves. When Mike entered the courtroom on the day of the trial, the tension in the air was unbearable. This day would decide everything. For the first time in a long while, Mike felt the weight of his own power, focused in his hands. All of his past victories in the ring now seemed insignificant compared to this internal fight. In that moment, it wasn't just about the trial or the outcome of the case. He was at the center of a battle that had no clear winners or losers. There was only the truth, for which he had to fight, no matter the cost. As the climax of the trial approached, the prosecutor seemed to have lost all hope. She knew Mike had already won. His strength wasn't just in his fists, but in his ability to speak the truth, in his capacity to say what others were too afraid to say. In that moment, she realized that this case would have far-reaching consequences for the entire system. This was no longer just Mike Tyson's case. It was a case about the system that needed to be changed. Mike didn't know how the trial would end, but he was sure of one thing: he could no longer stay silent. As he stood before the court, before everyone who was there, his eyes spoke volumes. These eyes weren't just watching, they were speaking of the future, a future where no one would hide behind masks or excuses. He was speaking for the truth, for the people who had suffered, for those who had been silenced simply because of the color of their skin. His words rang out like thunder, echoing throughout the courtroom. "I'm not a criminal. I'm not a rapist. I defended myself. I defended myself from what this system has set up for us, for people like me." His voice had such clarity that there was no room for doubt. There was not a shred of uncertainty in his words. The crowd outside erupted once again. In that moment, Mike understood that the victory wasn't just personal, it was a victory for everyone who had suffered. He was no longer alone. He had become a symbol, uniting people. They no longer feared speaking out. They no longer hid. The prosecutor sat down in her seat, her face pale as she realized the case had already been lost. The next morning, Mike found himself once again at the center of attention. But now it was not just for the press or the people who had shown up for him. This was the moment when everyone in the country felt that change was near. People understood that what was unfolding around Mike would become history, a history that wouldn't just be written in textbooks but would spark real change. Mike sat in his office in one of the buildings near the courthouse, surrounded by his lawyers and a group of supporters. He showed no emotion. He was focused. But inside, he felt a surge of power like never before. He knew this was the moment when he had to break the chains that had bound people to a system that oppressed them. When the case came down to the charges, no one could follow the rules when the rules themselves had been corrupted from the start. The forces that had worked against Mike from the beginning were now starting to retreat. He wasn't speaking just for himself anymore. He was speaking for millions of people who had been invisible, unheard. As the case took on even more significance, Mike's support became more and more apparent. His case was now a symbol for those who had long stayed silent. He had become the face of everything the country had endured. But while Mike felt confident in his victory, he knew the real battle was just beginning. His lawyers were preparing a new move that could radically change the outcome of the case. They had prepared documents that could reveal new evidence, new witnesses, showing that the charges against Mike Tyson were completely baseless. But deep down, Mike understood this battle wasn't about the court. It wasn't about processes or proof. This was a battle for the future, for the changes that were long overdue. Meanwhile, on the streets and in social media, Mike's support continued to grow. People who hadn't known his name just days ago were now shouting it from every corner of the country. Banners, flags, chants became part of everyday life. Everyone was waiting for the verdict. But the verdict had already been decided. It was no longer in the courtrooms, but in the hearts of the people. When the day of the trial arrived that would determine everything, Mike stood at the center of the courtroom, but he was no longer alone. He had become part of something far greater. The trial had become a symbol of struggle, and Mike was its living embodiment. It was no longer just a legal case. It had turned into a movement that was sweeping through the hearts of people all across the country. The desire not just to free Mike, but to free themselves from the chains that had held them down. The weight of everything that had transpired so far seemed almost unbearable. Mike had never been one to back down from a fight, but this time the battle was different. This wasn't just about his reputation or his legacy as a fighter. It was a fight for justice, a fight for those who had been oppressed, marginalized, and silenced for far too long. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Mike could feel the storm brewing inside him, the storm of emotions he had kept bottled up for years, only now starting to surge to the surface. His anger was no longer directed at just one man or one institution. It was a fury that extended to the entire system that had systematically oppressed Black and brown communities. As the case continued, the media frenzy outside the courthouse reached a new height. The press was in a frenzy, reporting every detail, every word, every moment of the trial as though it was the defining moment in a battle for the soul of the country. And in many ways, it was. Mike had become the symbol of defiance. No longer just a boxer, no longer just a man. He was a beacon for those who had been suffering in silence. And now the world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Mike's attorneys, backed by a team of legal experts, were making their final arguments. They were confident, but even they knew that the battle was not over yet. The prosecutor, however, was growing increasingly desperate. She had thrown everything she had at Mike, tried to discredit him, tried to paint him as a villain, but Mike's resolve only grew stronger, his voice unwavering as he spoke to the jury. I am not here because I want to be. I'm here because they forced me into a position where I had no choice but to defend myself. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the truth that they've been trying to hide for so long. This system is broken, and it's time for change. The jury sat in stunned silence as Mike's words echoed in the room. His message wasn't just about his innocence. It was about the innocence of everyone who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. Mike wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for the countless others who had been unjustly targeted, accused, and oppressed. Outside the courthouse, the crowds had grown larger. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants in this historic moment. The chants for justice filled the air, reverberating down the streets. Mike Tyson was no longer just a name. It had become a battle cry. The media had taken notice of the powerful, unwavering movement that had grown around him. He was no longer just a former champion. He had become the face of a revolution that was about to shake the foundations of the very system that had tried to break him. As the day of the final verdict approached, the world was holding its breath. Everyone knew that the outcome of this case would have far-reaching consequences. But for Mike, it was no longer just about winning. He had already won. In every speech he made, in every action he took, Mike had won the battle for his dignity, his pride, and his voice. The truth had already been heard. But the battle wasn't over yet. There were those who still sought to silence him, who still believed they could break his spirit. The case wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It was about the struggle for freedom, and Mike was prepared to fight until the very end. The final days leading up to the verdict were like an oppressive weight hanging over Mike. Each morning, the media's relentless coverage, the invasive questions, and the constant stares from strangers were almost too much to bear. He had seen what this system was capable of doing to people, and now it was his turn to feel the full force of its power. But in all the chaos, Mike found one constant, his resolve. Nothing was going to break him now. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to back down. On the eve of the verdict, Mike sat alone in his hotel room, staring out the window at the city lights below. For the first time in weeks, he felt a strange sense of calm. The world was watching, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had spoken his truth, and now, whatever happened next, it wasn't up to him. It was in the hands of those who were supposed to serve justice. The air outside was thick with tension. Protesters filled the streets, their chants for justice echoing through the city. They were here for Mike, but they were also here for themselves. They were here for every person who had been wronged by a system that turned a blind eye to their suffering. Mike wasn't just fighting for his own innocence anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something far more important. He was fighting for a cause that would outlive him, outlive his career, and outlive this trial. He was fighting for a change that had been long overdue. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was equally tense. The judge had instructed the jury to deliberate, and now they were in the back room, weighing the evidence, sifting through the arguments. Mike's legal team had worked tirelessly, presenting everything they had to prove his innocence. They had dismantled the prosecutor's case piece by piece, showing the inconsistencies, the lies, the racism that had been the foundation of the charges against him. But in the end, it wasn't just about proving his innocence, it was about exposing the system for what it really was. The prosecution had tried everything, but they had underestimated Mike's resolve. They had tried to break him, tried to paint him as the villain, but no matter how hard they tried, Mike's truth had stood firm. And now, it was time for the jury to decide. As the hours passed, the tension grew. People in the courthouse, the press, and the public all waited, holding their breath, wondering what the outcome would be. When the jury finally returned, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would determine Mike's fate. The world seemed to stop as he read the verdict aloud. Not guilty. The words rang out like a thunderclap, a shockwave that reverberated through the room. The weight that had been pressing on Mike for so long lifted in an instant. It was over. The truth had won. Mike's defense team erupted in cheers, but Mike remained still. He didn't jump up, didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, letting the enormity of it all wash over him. The victory wasn't just his, it belonged to all those who had fought for him, to every person who had stood up and said, "Enough is enough." Mike had become a symbol of defiance, a symbol of hope for all those who had been silenced for far too long. As he left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. The chants of justice and freedom filled the air. Mike Tyson had been acquitted, but more than that, he had sparked something much larger. He had become the face of a revolution, a movement that could not be stopped. And as the cameras flashed and the crowd roared, Mike knew that his fight was far from over. The verdict was just the beginning. The days after the trial felt like a blur. The verdict had come down, and Mike Tyson had been acquitted, but the world around him didn't suddenly become peaceful. The media storm that had consumed his life for months didn't fade away. In fact, it only intensified. People wanted to know what came next for Mike Tyson. What would this man, who had been both a legend and a target of the system, do now? Mike walked through the streets of New York City, his city, but it no longer felt like home. The cheers of the crowd had faded, replaced by the quiet whispers of people trying to figure out what his next move would be. He had done something that few ever dared to do. He had stood up to the system, and even though he had won, he knew the fight wasn't over. He had achieved his victory in court, but the battle for justice, for equality, and for respect would continue far beyond the courtroom. That night, as Mike sat alone in his apartment, he reflected on everything he had gone through. The trial had been brutal. He had been forced to relive the worst moments of his life, to confront the world that had tried to tear him down. But in the end, he had stood tall. His name would go down in history, not just as a boxer, but as a man who had refused to be broken by the weight of the world. And that was the legacy he had wanted to leave behind, a legacy that went beyond the boxing ring, a legacy of resilience, of defiance, and of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. But Mike knew that legacy wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had supported him, everyone who had believed in him when no one else did. It was about the countless people who were still fighting, still struggling, still facing the same battles he had fought. The fight for equality, the fight for justice, the fight for freedom. It wasn't over, and Mike was going to keep fighting, keep speaking out, until things changed. As he looked out the window at the skyline of the city, he made a promise to himself. He wasn't done. The world had watched him fight for his own freedom, but there was more to do. He would use his platform, his voice, to speak for those who couldn't. He would stand as a beacon of hope for anyone who felt forgotten, for anyone who had been oppressed or silenced. The story of Mike Tyson wasn't just a story of a boxer. It was a story of a man who had been knocked down, time and time again, but had never stayed down. He had fought with his fists, but now he was going to fight with his words, with his actions, and with his heart. And though the world had tried to break him, in the end, it was Mike Tyson who had stood victorious.